All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're going to continue talking about how processes going on in the environment and in nature are able to alter allele frequencies and as a result, alter the course of evolution. So last time we talked about things like mutations and sexual recombination, just providing us the means of having variation in our population. Today we're going to talk specifically about three additional factors that can alter those allele frequencies. We'll start with natural selection. We'll talk a little bit about genetic drift as well as gene flow. So when we're talking natural selection, this is typically what we're thinking about when we discuss the topic of evolution, because this really is that differential reproductive success. So when we talk natural selection, remember it's not just about survival, it's about reproduction. So having those variations existing in our population in a particular characteristic should then mean that certain individuals not only survive better than others, but are better able to reproduce compared to others. And so that differential success in reproduction really is what's going to end up driving the changes in allele frequencies and as a result, driving evolution. So certain alleles should be better suited for the current conditions in the environment. The individuals with those current sets of traits, those current alleles, should then reproduce at a higher rate compared to those lacking that allele. And so as that happens generation after generation, greater portions of the population should reflect that allele frequency based on the traits that are then more suited, more adapted for the current environmental conditions. If those conditions change, then those frequencies would theoretically change as well over time as that shift in reproductive success changes as well. So let's talk genetic drift for a second. So natural selection really is this idea of sort of predictable change. If I know a set of conditions, I should be able to hypothesize which traits in that population make sense to be beneficial in that environment, and then I should be able to predict the frequency that those alleles should appear in successive generations. Genetic drift is sort of the opposite of that. These are unpredictable fluctuations in allele frequencies from one generation to the next, but genetic drift happens in a really specific set of circumstances, and it's because of a population's finite size. So just think about it statistically. The larger the number of samples to pick from, the greater you have the ability to represent the different options. The smaller that population gets, the more likely you get these random fluctuations because you've got less to pick from. Think about it like going from a really small college or university and looking at their football team. All right, chances are they probably aren't the best of the best because statistically they've got less talent to pick from, the pool's smaller, versus going to some big D1 school like Penn State where their football team should be relatively spectacular because they've just got the talent pool to pick from. Same thing with, say, music or theater. All right, you would generally suspect a smaller school would have a harder time finding really talented people, and it's just statistics. You've got less to pick from than if you were to go to some really big school and now you've got a much bigger pool of talent to draw from. Is that the case in every situation? No, of course not. And the same thing would be true here in natural populations and looking at specific characteristics. But generally speaking, you have a much higher statistical likelihood to have less to pick from the smaller that sample becomes. And so when we look at genetic drift, these are cases where we get this reduction in overall genetic variation, and as a result, this unpredictable change from one generation to the next that really doesn't have anything to do, or minimally to do, with the actual environmental conditions and more to do with just this reduction in variation. And so it's a matter of chance which alleles end up becoming less prevalent in generations than it does when we have a big, healthy population and lots of options to choose from. So here's just an example, right? I've got this wildflower population, and generation 1, my frequency of dominant versus recessive is 70-30. My next generation, only 5 of those 10 plants actually leave offspring. And now I'm looking at a 50-50. Do this again, now only 2 of those plants leave offspring, and now I've actually gotten to the point where I have what we call fixed an allele in the population to the point where this entire population is completely dominant. And in the case of genetic drift, these changes in these frequencies wouldn't have anything to do with predicted environmental conditions, and instead are just happening because that population is so small to start with. So there's 2 situations where this genetic drift tends to have large impacts. And so we discuss them, we characterize them, and that's your bottleneck effect and your founder effect. So really these 2 situations are, how do I get a population so small that genetic drift has the potential to actually become a process that's occurring. So your bottleneck effect suddenly reduces your population size, usually because of some major event. So what ends up happening here is that only a small portion of that population is surviving, and what that population is left over rarely ends up reflecting the original diversity in that original population's gene pool. And so this can happen by things like hurricanes or major earthquakes or mudslides, or a lot of these tend to be big events, and it's really, you were lucky enough to be out of harm's way and survive it, right? So that huge reduction in the gene pool has nothing to do with your ability to have survived that event well. It was just happenstance, it was just by chance that you survived with your set of traits. Your set of traits really didn't have anything to do with being better at surviving that event than somebody else. Hopefully that makes sense. And so that remaining population rarely ends up looking like what the original population did. So this is a pretty common graphic when we talk about bottleneck effect. So here's my original population. I had a couple yellows, all right, and mostly whites and a handful of blues. We go through this major event, let's just call it a hurricane, all right, and then I look at that surviving population, and you can see that that clearly does not represent the diversity we saw in that original population. All right, the vast majority of these survivors happen to be blue, and just a single white, and none of the yellow is represented at all. All right, so we got a much closer, maybe 50-50, 40-60 mix of blue to white, and now it's overwhelmingly blue, and none of the yellow is there at all. And again, those traits have nothing to do with what was helpful in the environment. It was just they happened to be lucky enough to be the ones who survived, and now they're going to constitute the gene pool for the next generation, and so on down the line. So depending on how those traits get inherited, we may never see that yellow come back. It may just be gone forever because it didn't survive that particular event. Founder effect is another type of genetic drift. And so this occurs when you get a few individuals who for some reason become isolated from that larger population. And now within that small population, the ability for them to successfully reproduce really is just we hope we have the traits we need. And so this can happen in things like tectonic shifts, islands getting separated like you're seeing here in the picture. This is something we have the tendency as humans to do to a lot of natural populations by putting in roads or building developments and fragmenting their habitats and preventing them from being able to get to the original population. So let's just use the example of putting in 78, right? And we may have cut a small portion of the deer population on one side of 78 and isolated it from the larger population on the opposite side of 78. And so by doing that, putting that highway in and fragmenting that population, that smaller isolated population may not necessarily be accurately reflective of the original population. It was just whoever got trapped on that side by the time the highway project got finished. And again, this doesn't necessarily represent that original population, and as a result, that lack of variation can end up becoming a problem. So overall, the effects, whether it's a result of a bottleneck effect event or a founder effect event, genetic drift generally has the same basic outcomes. First and foremost, it is a significant problem in smaller populations. It also means that those allele frequencies are happening at random, and as a result of that randomness, we can get alleles that get fixed in populations that aren't necessarily the beneficial ones. Overarchingly, we're losing genetic variation within those populations, and that's a problem. This is also a big issue when we start talking about trying to mitigate and help populations of threatened, endangered, potentially going extinct organisms. Their populations are so small as a result of whatever is causing them to go down that road toward extinction. And so our ability to try and help those kinds of populations is challenged by things like genetic drift. All right, because we can end up getting situations where the variation that was necessary, the trait that was necessary to really drive their survival, got wiped out as a result of just random chance because of genetic drift. Gene flow, this is also something that will alter the frequencies in a population, and gene flow is either the loss or the gain of alleles based on the movement of individuals from one population to the next. The more gene flow that happens between two isolated populations over time, the more we mix up their gene pools, the more we reduce the differences between them over time. So that can be a good thing. We basically end up creating a bigger population. So go back to the idea of putting in a highway. If we can successfully manage the migration and the movement of individuals between the two populations that got stuck on either side of the highway, the more we can allow that gene flow to happen, and the more we can mix up and diversify their populations and potentially be helpful to them, right? When we look at each individual isolated population in a situation like this, depending on what individuals are moving in and moving out and the alleles that they're taking with them, you can decrease or increase the overall fitness of the population. I would say if you take a look at both populations collectively, if this is happening enough, you're probably overall increasing the fitness of the two populations collectively. But that really depends on who's moving and what they're taking. So when we talk about true evolution, one of the things that we come across is the stopping of gene flow. If I isolate these two populations, I prevent the gene flow from happening. I now set up the possibility for these two populations to eventually, if they both are capable of surviving, evolving into two different species because I'm not allowing them to mix those gene pools up anymore. So ultimately, adaptive evolution, right? Natural selection is that primary mechanism. That's what we're expecting to happen. That's the predictability, assuming that we understand the traits that exist and the conditions that are present, and as a result of that, understanding which traits should be passed on more often, assuming the population size is large enough that genetic drift is not an issue. So over successive generations, we should be accumulating and maintaining favorable genotypes based on the characteristics of the environment that are present. As new genetic variations arise, either by chance, mutation, those things will also then get sorted and favored by natural selection. So it really is increasing that match between that population of organisms and their environment. And it's a continual process. That environment rarely stays stagnant forever. So as that environment changes over time, then those allele frequencies should shift to match that. Keep in mind that genetic variation in those individuals is ultimately the raw material for natural selection. So without that genetic variation, natural selection can't exist. If I get a population like all of those red flowers that we saw earlier in this particular section, there's no variation for that trait anymore. And so that characteristic either gets carried on because it happens to be useful, or if it's detrimental enough to their survival, it just wipes out the population and extinction is the end result.